Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I'd like to discuss the next round of trade barriers that British exporters are going to be landed with in about 2 months. Thanks to that lovely extreme Tory Brexit is laying waste to our economy and our standard of living. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news in politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So you may think Brexit is pretty damaging to our exports. You know, the checks taking place at the borders by EU countries means that it takes longer to get shipments through. The fact that we are now a third country means we are subject to third country rules. That means there are some things we can't trade at all with the EU. Sometimes there are things we can trade, but only in limited numbers, so that still hits our businesses. Then there's the problem with losing freedom of movement. Producers can't always get the staff to make their products, at which point the trade barriers become meaningless, can't even make the stuff. Then there's the issue of finding someone to transport our goods at a price that allows them to remain competitive in the EU. Frankly, it's hard enough to remain competitive in our own market right now. But these are just some of the problems that Brexit poses to our productivity. Brexit is coming in instalments. We can't afford them. We haven't finished yet. We have still not reciprocated border checks. The EU might be checking our paperwork and goods and applying third country trade rules. We aren't. EU goods can pass into Britain. In theory, they've got to follow the same rules, but there's no one checking them. They don't suffer the checks that their British competitors have. In theory, these checks are supposed to begin next year, but they've already been delayed so many times. I certainly expect them to be delayed again. We don't apply checks at a time when we already have critical shortages of things that we import from the EU. But not all of the Brexit systems are being implemented by the UK, which keeps delaying them. There's a big one going to be applied by the EU in January. With no reason to suppose that this will be delayed. It may be softened in theory, but we'll get onto that later on. Now, browsing through the news, I was reminded that rules of origin is going to be coming to the end of its grace period. See, although the government said that our trade and cooperation agreement was a tariff-free trade deal, it's not technically true. It's not. There are several ways in which tariffs can still apply to British exports to the EU. Firstly, if we diverge our standards in a way that gives our businesses a competitive advantage, the EU can remove that competitive advantage by placing corrective tariffs on the affected goods. This provision also covers them in the event of the trade war that the government are threatening with the EU over the Northern Ireland Protocol. We will have tariffs imposed on our exports where there currently are none. But the second is applicable right now. There are still goods where there are tariffs. In order for our exports to be tariff-free in the EU, they have to meet rules of origin standards. In simple terms, and there's nothing simple about this, I'm not going to pretend to understand it all, it means that the goods must be mostly of British or at least EU origin to qualify. You can import raw materials from the EU, make them into something and sell them back. That's sort of okay. But if you produce something in Britain, but it's mostly made up of materials from outside that area, it doesn't meet the rules of origin standards and cannot be sold in the EU tariff-free. There will be tariffs on it. And there are two problems for manufacturers with this stipulation. The first is that if your product does not meet those requirements, then tariffs are payable on those goods. That means they cost more for EU customers and are less competitive in the European market. If you are making something that does not exist to the same standard in the EU, it's quite a niche product, you might get away with it, they'll just have to pay more for it. If, however, you have lots of competitors in the EU, you will struggle to sell. Now that leaves you with a few options. You can just sack off the EU sales. Some businesses have had to do that. It means making less money, maybe having to make some staff redundant. Either way, it means our British economy shrinks. Not a good outcome. The second option is to shift some production to the EU. Like have your production for the British market in Britain and your European market in the EU. If you have enough EU sales that they can afford to do that, it makes financial sense to do that. Obviously, that means losing jobs in Britain. They'll have to be shifted abroad. It means setting them up in the EU. Or maybe Northern Ireland. Guess that would work as well. But it still means shrinking the British economy, which is not a good outcome. The final option is to change your supply of raw materials to the point where it would qualify under the rules of origin. Now, there will be a reason why you are getting your supplies from further afield. It might be that they're just cheaper, even with the cost of transport, in which case you are still hitting your profits by doing this. It might be worth it to still sell enough to keep your business going. But it might be that the raw materials simply don't exist in Europe or Britain. You buggered. You can't get, you get them from wherever you get them from, or you can't get them at all. Like, it might be iron ore, something like that, the local steelworks. Either way, you're still making less money, and it will still have the effect of shrinking the British economy. The third option, if viable, is the best, because it doesn't necessarily lead to job losses, but all of them are still a net loss to a profitability of British producers, and therefore represent at the very least lower tax receipts, which means less money for our public services. And it might mean more unemployment. Not that the government are worried about that. They obviously think skilled engineers are just going to go and pick carrots for a living. But that's if you don't qualify. And bear in mind that our manufacturing relies heavily on foreign imports of raw materials. So these tariffs are not just on a few products. You know, these tariffs on our so-called tariff-free deal will apply to a lot of producers and a lot of their goods. But the second consequence is for products that do meet the standards. Well, at least these businesses are fine, right? No, far from it. See, the problem is this. How do you prove that your goods are mostly British or from the EU, whatever, that they qualify standards of rules of origin? Yeah, a hefty paper trail. You need mountains of paperwork proving the origin of every molecule of your product. It's not enough to say that it was produced in Britain. What you made it from has to also be produced in Britain, or at least most of it. And the paperwork required is apparently quite daunting. So daunting, in fact, that a 1-year grace period was permitted in order for exporters from both the EU and Britain to get their heads around it. That 1-year grace period runs out in 66 days' time, I think. Now, the reverse is also true of EU exporters to Britain. But that's a proportionally smaller amount of their GDP, and we aren't checking their paperwork properly anyway. But EU authorities do not sound like they're going to delay their own checks on our exports. From January, a number of things are going to happen. First, products that do not meet the standards but are organised with the paperwork are going to find it harder to sell in the EU because of the higher costs of their goods. Those higher costs come as a consequence of two extra costs now. One, the costs of paying someone to deal with the paperwork. Two, the tariffs that will be payable on your goods once your EU customers get their hands on it. Second, you've got products that do not meet the standards, but those companies are not organised with the paperwork. They are going to fall foul of checks that go, this paperwork's a load of rubbish. They are going to fall foul quite badly. You can easily imagine a situation whereby an exporter thinks that they're good to go. They just go, well, we've been exporting this year, no problem. They carry on in January just as they have been. And someone looks at it and goes, no, mate. No. And they get hit with tariffs after the checks. Could easily tip a viable trade into an unviable one, costing the business a lot of money. Then you've got products that do meet the standards, but they could still mess their paperwork up, creating huge delays in being able to get their goods into the EU without extra costs. I mean, as I say, there are already extra costs in employing people to deal with the paperwork, which is a problem, but the tariff costs. And if this results in delays getting your goods to your customer may just switch supplier before you get yourself organised, and you've lost them then. So the business can still be lost even if ultimately your goods satisfy these rules of origin, because even the goods that meet these rules of origin do not just get to carry on in January like they are now. See, right now you can assess your own goods and export it as meeting rules of origin. You just put some paperwork on it and go, yeah, it meets it, no problem. And you don't have to have the wider paperwork proving it right now. Just don't leave any made in China labels on it and you should be good to go. From January, they're not going to take your word for it anymore. Now, a trade consultant quoted in the Financial Times said that some companies were just attaching rules of origin statements without the slightest clue as to whether it met the standards or not. So it's not just that they're not filling in all the onerous paperwork right now because they don't need to. Some of them have no idea if their product would meet the standards or not. Not a clue. Very soon, this will not be good enough. This is going to mean another hit to our exports. And this is the thing with Brexit. I've said before, people may imagine that you get this big shock from Brexit. Even the people who'll face up to the fact that it's going to create this huge shock. They go, yeah, we'll get this big shock. When we leave the single market customs union, I absolutely appreciate that. But then we stabilise and then we'll get better. No, this gets worse because we didn't implement Brexit in one go. We are probably years away from fully implementing Brexit. And if you think the phased nature allows us to manage bits of Brexit, because that makes sense, yeah, but we're managing it in phases, so we manage one bit and then we move on to the next and so on. I simply ask this, how's that going so far? Have things eased this year? Are we on top of the initial Brexit problems and ready to tackle the next phase? No, we are not. Things have gotten worse. And they will continue to get worse as more and more Brexit red tape is heaped on top of us. And I also have to remind people, we are an island. We are severely limited in our capacity to get freight out of the country. When we slow down the traffic at ports, that is trade that cannot get through in time. You know, experts are really clear here. How much of a mess this ends up being in January depends on how hard the EU decide to come down on this. So as with everything else, we are now entirely dependent upon the EU showing us some mercy here. It's just as well we haven't pissed them off or threatened to tear up our treaties with them, isn't it? Or called them rude words for several years. God, could you imagine if we were that stupid? But those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, don't forget to click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, please also click the Patreon link for details. And until next time, I'll see you later.